Well, good afternoon and welcome to this virtual event on Afghanistan, on America's partners there, and on the attempts to save and evacuate them now that the Taliban has taken control of the country. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. I know everybody watching today is acutely aware of the Taliban's capture of Kabul, the rush of many thousands of Americans and Afghans to depart the country, and the U.S. effort that is ongoing at the international airport. President Biden has said that that the United States will evacuate Americans, Afghan helpers, that is special immigrant visa holders, along with their immediate families, and other Afghans at special risk from the Taliban. It's hard to know exactly how many individuals fit into each of these categories, but clearly it's in the tens of thousands at least. This is not, of course, the first time the United States has been faced with a challenge similar, at least in some ways. In 1975, the Ford administration evacuated more than 100,000 Vietnamese refugees to the United States via Guam, and the U.S. airlifted thousands of Iraqis and Kosovar Albanians to safety in 1996 and 1999, respectively. But it is obviously a massive undertaking that is taking place right now. Today, we're going to spend this session reviewing the status of the evacuation, the lessons learned from past experiences, and where things should go from here. And to that end, I'm really pleased to have with us three individuals with direct and really unique experience. Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts is the co-chair of the Honoring Our Promises Working Group. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee, a Marine who served 4 tours in Iraq and has been if not the leader in Congress on these issues. Ambassador Richard Armitage served as Deputy Secretary of State during the George W. Bush administration, along with a number of distinguished roles in U.S. government in different agencies, including the Pentagon. He served multiple tours in Vietnam during his time in the U.S. Navy. And as a civilian, he managed the evacuation of 31,000 Vietnamese and naval assets before the fall of Saigon in 1975. And Lisa Curtis is Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program here at CNAS. She served until January as Deputy Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for South and Central Asia, and among other things, participated in the negotiations with the Taliban. So thank you, the three of you, for joining us, particularly at this important time. Congressman Moulton, maybe I can start with you and ask 2 questions. First, what's your understanding of where things stand right now? And then second, how did we get here?
Well, Richard, first of all, thank you very much for having me, to all the CNAS crew. It's good to be back, and there couldn't be a more timely moment to discuss what's happening right now in Afghanistan. You know, I've said for a long time now that we're not going to win the war in Afghanistan, but there are devastating ways we could lose. And we see several of those unfolding before us today. The idea that we would depart Afghanistan in chaos and leave so many of our allies behind goes against all our values. And it goes against the promises that people like myself made on the ground to people in places like Iraq and Afghanistan when we asked them to trust us, to work with us. We knew they were risking their lives. We knew they were putting their lives in our hands, but we said, we've got you, we've got your back, and we're not going to leave you behind. And yet the course that we are on today suggests we're going to leave a lot of these people behind. The current status is that the United States now has more troops in Afghanistan at Kabul airport than we had in the entire country just a few weeks ago. More troops. And they're under much greater threat because we've so badly mismanaged our retreat. The president has promised to get all American citizens out by the end of August, but we don't seem to have a very clear plan to do so. And notably, he has not said we will get all of our Afghan allies out before we leave. Teams like mine on Capitol Hill have been fielding requests from all over the country and all over the world, veterans reaching out to us, aid workers, diplomats, trying to find someone who can simply get their people on a list. I was up after midnight last night when a spreadsheet finally came in from someone on the ground at the State Department in Kabul. I quickly woke up my team, and they got to work filling names into this new spreadsheet so that people could simply get through the gate when they come and meet the Marines between them and the Taliban. I mean, the simple idea that we have the Taliban between American citizens and US Marines at the airport, and therefore we're relying on the goodwill of the Taliban to save our people, is extraordinary and shameful all at once. And I can't emphasize enough how quickly this could go further south. The chaos outside the gate is so bad right now that women and children are being crushed literally to death. People are dying just waiting to get into the airport. But the Taliban could start massacring people at any moment. There are already reports that they're going house to house around the country, starting to hang government officials, assassinate people they thought were collaborators or work with the Afghan security forces. And we can only expect that Taliban campaign to continue and expand. Thank God it hasn't taken place literally outside the airport gates, but that could start at any moment. And the reason we got here fundamentally, look, we can spend a lot of time, and I'm sure CNAS will host many events to debate whether or not we should have withdrawn from Afghanistan or tried to maintain the status quo with a small troop presence there. But now's not the time for that debate. The bottom line is that the president made his decision to withdraw. But people like myself have been calling for months, both before but especially after he made that decision, to start this evacuation. One of my worst fears was that our efforts in Congress to expand the special immigrant visa program would in fact distract from the need to conduct an immediate evacuation. And that's why I have kept my focus on the evacuation. I laid out a plan 2 months ago, served up on a platter for the administration to get people to Guam after asking them for weeks for a plan and receiving nothing. When Secretary Austin and Chairman Milley came before the House Armed Services Committee 2 months ago, my first question to them was, why have you not begun the evacuation already? If we had started getting these people out, our citizens and our allies, if we had started that months ago, we would not see the chaos unfolding outside the gate today. That's one small but significant way in which we could have made this better, and the current disaster could have been avoided. I look forward to this panel discussion because I have consulted with Mr. Armitage several times over the past couple months for his own advice on how to get this right. And I have to say, his track record is better than ours so far. So we have a lot to learn today, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Ambassador Armitage. The comparison of the week, at least, is to the fall of Saigon. You were in Saigon during the fall and were responsible for evacuating literally tens of thousands of South Vietnamese to safety. Maybe I can ask you, one, how much does this resonate with the experience that we had before? And are there a couple of lessons that we could still absorb for how a successful evacuation then could help us improve the situation now?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Captain Moulton, for your comments. I appreciate it. The similarities between Vietnam and Afghanistan, I think, begin with the fact that in both cases they were goat rodeos. They were not planned out very well. Everyone is making things up on the fly, and that appears to be the case that we face now. Second is, in both cases, we were perceived as cutting and running. The decision, for instance, in Afghanistan, I personally think it was the right decision, but the timing and the manner of effecting the evacuation are just all FUBAR, as far as I can see. And third, and biggest similarity that I see between Vietnam and Afghanistan is the fact that we've come a cropper on the same issue. It wasn't that Vietnamese or Afghans couldn't fight. God knows it's all they do from the time they're children. God knows they know how to shoot. The question has to do with whether the corrupt governments in Saigon and in Kabul were worth the sacrifice of their soldiers and of their people. And apparently the answer is not. Now, there are a lot of other things that crop up. There are similarities and dissimilarities. There is, however, one point I would like to make. I think Captain Moulton's probably on the same wavelength as this. This is insane to try to have SIVs for these people who served with us, alongside us, and risked their lives with us. The only way to affect this properly would be to bring as many people out as possible and sort them out later, whether it's at Guam, whether it's in Qatar, it doesn't matter, but sort them out at our leisure. So I'll content myself with those comments, Richard, and we can talk more later.
All right. Thank you. Lisa, let me go to you and ask maybe a broader question. A lot now, at least at the moment, turns on, I hate to say the goodwill of the Taliban, but at least their ability to not hinder people that are trying to get to the airport, to not start the kind of reprisal killings or the massacres that Congressman Moulton said could be on offer at any moment. I mean, you were in the room negotiating with these folks. They're branding themselves over the last few days as sort of not your father's Taliban. They're more moderate now and all these things. I mean, do you believe that, or do you have a sense of how they will rule once they consolidate power?
Well, thank you, Richard. First, let me just talk about the evacuation and how important it is for the U.S. Credibility and the fact that the U.S. has a moral responsibility to settle as many Afghans, to get those Afghans out of the country, those who supported our mission, who believed in the mission. We need to get them out, get them to safety. I was slightly encouraged that President Biden hinted that he could extend the timeline of having U.S. troops on the ground there. In hopes that means that the administration will commit to getting this done, committing the resources that are necessary. I think this is one way. It's been, our country has taken such a hit with its global credibility over this, that at least we should show that we are not completely abandoning those Afghan partners that supported us, and that we are going to put the resources and the time, the effort that is necessary to get them out of the country safely and resettled. Now, with regard to the Taliban, they have been saying all the right things, right? The leader, the spokesperson, Zabiullah Mujahid, on Tuesday made a point of saying, we're going to allow women to work, we're going to allow girls to go to school, we're not going to engage in reprisal killings. But the problem is we have to look at the actions and not just listen to the words that the Taliban is saying. And I think Representative Moulton made very clear that we are seeing some of these reprisal killings. We're also seeing that women weren't let into a university in Herat. We're seeing that a lot of schools are being closed down and girls are not being able to go to school. So I think we really need to wait and watch and see if the Taliban's actions will match their words. And this goes also for the issue of terrorism. I think that we still see the links between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We saw that jails were emptied, putting hundreds, maybe thousands of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other terrorists on the streets. If you consider the fact that we invested billions and hundreds of military intelligence operations to get those people in jail, and now they're just roaming free, there's a lot of concerns about a terrorist safe haven reemerging there. So I think before there's any decision to even consider recognizing the Taliban or providing them any, international legitimacy. We need to look at these two things. What are they doing on the ground with regard to human rights, women's rights? Are they sincerely avoiding reprisal killings? How are they treating the population? And then also, what are they doing with regard to the terrorists that we know are there in Afghanistan? So I think there's a lot of questions that remains, and we can't take the Taliban at face value.
Great. I wanted to let folks who are tuning in know that if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the question box, and we'll try to get to your questions for the speakers if you have them. Congressman Moulton, I want to very shortly get to some specifics on what we do now, but one last question on the prelude to this moment. The two sort of arguments against, I suppose, having done what you advocated for so long. One is, well, there weren't that many people that actually wanted to leave. And then two, had the United States been seen as starting a mass evacuation, it would have provoked a crisis in confidence in the government would have fell. So it was prudent not to do that. Do you accept either of those reasons for, or is it?
Absolutely not. I mean, the first is patently absurd. There's been a backlog of special immigrant visa applications for literally years, since before I came to Congress. That's why I've been fighting since I came to Congress in 2015 to expand the program. I mean, we all saw the images around the world of people literally clinging to airplanes to get out of Kabul. So don't tell me they don't want to go. Now, on the second point, would it have precipitated a quicker fall of the United States, of the Afghan government? I mean, obviously it's a completely moot point now. It's almost silly to talk about it. But the point is that we could have had an orderly evacuation if we had started earlier. And so if you were shipping out a few hundred a day, then no, you wouldn't have had a crisis in confidence, because frankly, people wouldn't even have known it was happening. It would be totally different than the chaos we see on the ground right now.
Right. Congressman, let me ask you also now, shifting over to, okay, now what? There's a whole number of policy decisions that the administration needs to make very quickly. One is related to this self-imposed August 31st deadline. Do you think, so the first question is, do you think that if the president said we'll stay beyond that, or suggested we'll stay beyond that if Americans are left, he didn't say that with respect to Afghans, Afghan helpers, SIVs. So do you think that the presence on the ground at the airport should stay past August 31st if there are Afghans who still have not been evacuated? And then two, they have this categories of, you have Americans, you have SIVs and their families, you have this other category, which at least to my knowledge has not yet been defined, of at special risk from the Taliban. How would you go about defining that? I mean, should this be an operation that goes on till anyone who would like to leave can leave, or how do you think about that?
So, Richard, on the first question, let me be clear. I've been very publicly calling on the president over the last week to make a clear commitment to stay until this mission is complete. But that's not a new call for me. I've been making that for several months as well. Since the whole operation to withdraw from Afghanistan began, I made it clear that the administration must commit to staying until we can get everyone out. So that hasn't changed. And it's shocking to me that we still have not learned the lesson about putting lines in the sand based on dates. We should have conditions-based withdrawals. So I think it's terribly disappointing that the August 31st date ever came up in discussion. We should leave when this is done. Now, on the second question, in terms of the different categories of people, I mean, look, this is a big problem, but it goes back to Ambassador Armitage's point, which is that we need to do the vetting after we get them out. We need to sort out the details once they're in a safe place. The fact that people are dying literally just trying to get into the gate of the airport is a humanitarian disaster of our own fault. We need to get them out first, sort out the paperwork later. The system that the administration in the State Department has set up today means that someone could be denied entry to the airport, denied a flight out of Kabul, literally due to a typo in their paperwork. No one should ever die because of a typo.
Ambassador Armitage, let me go to you on a couple of these things. So one, to the point about, well, I guess I would ask whether you, it's your belief that the operation should continue until essentially anyone who would like to leave can leave, and then determine identities and vetting and everything somewhere else. And then two, and this is directly on the Congressman's point about bureaucracy and typos and everything. My understanding of what happened in Vietnam and your role in particular was there wasn't a lot of bureaucracy involved in that evacuation. In fact, most of it was being improvised on the ground, and people like you who were going to ask for forgiveness later rather than permission in advance. And how much of that do you think should have a role here?
Well, the latter question first, Richard. I think that should be accorded a prominent role. We ought to get people out and worry about it later. Congressman Moulton is correct. Dying for a typo seems to me just absurd. Second, I think that President Biden should be willing to consider staying on. I know that left to their own devices, had things been a day or two slower with the Taliban getting into Kabul, I would bet that the U.S. military was going to put up a cordon sanitaire in some sort of diameter around Kabul and basically threaten the Taliban with airstrikes, military force, etc., if they interfered. I don't think that's quite possible right now, but I think it is quite possible to stay as long as we have to until we've gotten the majority of people out. I do not think we'll get all of them out. And I don't think that the Taliban 2.0 is going to allow all those who want to get into the airport to do so. They may put a good face forward in Kabul, but in Herat, Jalalabad, Kandahar, Mazar-e-Sharif, I'd like to see what face they're putting forward.
Let me just follow up with you on the point about the cordon sanitaire or lack thereof. So obviously there's the airport and getting in, and then there's getting to the airport, even for those who live in Kabul. Of course, Afghanistan's a big country and not everyone lives in Kabul. But is there a role for the United States, the U.S. military, beyond what the administration has said, which is essentially that they're asking the Taliban to allow safe passage of these people to the airport?
Well, I would say that if we had knowledge of a group of people within 4, 5, 6, 7 miles of the airport, it may very well be worth the U.S. military's time, effort, and the risk to try to get the majority of those people in. And I think that's eminently doable and possible. The idea of a cordon sanitaire was fine before Sunday when the Taliban just walked in, and that's no longer on the table. Second, Richard, if I may, we seem to still think that there's huge value to the Taliban by being recognized by the United States. Well, wait a minute. We should recognize the Taliban based on their behavior, on their governance, on their respect for human rights and human freedoms. But right now, in my view, they don't give a damn whether the United States recognizes them or not. They're winners. And they've got Pakistan, Iran, to some extent, Russia and China in their corner right now. So I don't think they're in a wild hurry that would give us that much more leverage. But perhaps I'm misinformed.
Congressman, let me ask you about this question about U.S. military role or U.S. government role outside the airport. Secretary Austin said yesterday he doesn't have the capability to do anything but secure the airport. So one, do you think something else should be done outside the perimeter of the airport by anyone involved in the U.S. government? And two, would that take, if it was military, would that take additional capability?
Richard, we're the United States of America. We absolutely have the capacity to do more than just cordon the airport. So Secretary Austin is flat out wrong when he says that, and he should know better. I mean, that if we want to do more, we could. Now, there's a legitimate question as to whether that's the right decision. It's going to put more American lives at risk. There already are a lot of American lives at risk on the ground right now. But it is absolutely within our capability to do more. And I don't think it sends a good message. I don't think it sends the right message to the Taliban to say that we're incapable of putting more pressure on them or doing other things. So I completely disagree with that. The other thing that's going on right now is the State Department is really the organization that's holding up the exfiltration of refugees, both American citizens and Afghans who are just simply trying to get into the gate, because they're the ones who are insisting on this bureaucracy that both Richard and I think should go away and be sorted out later. So I recently received an update, literally just a few minutes ago, from the State Department that they have 20 consular officers on the ground in Kabul, and wait for it, they're surging to 40 consular officers. This is the greatest foreign policy disaster that we've seen in a very long time, and they're sending 40 people to deal with it? That's absurd. We've got 6,000 troops on the ground. We need a little bit more effort than 40 consular officers from the United States State Department.
Lisa, let me go to you for a minute. Everyone who has been even tangentially involved in Afghanistan over the years is getting calls and emails from desperate people who want to get out or whose family members would like to get out. You and I have been on some email chains, including just a couple of hours ago. And some of these folks are well outside of Kabul, huge risks if they're going to try to make it to the airport. And what is your view on what the U.S. government role should be in that set of issues?
Well, I agree with Representative Moulton. We should be pouring all of the resources at our disposal on this evacuation and putting more people that are necessary, both for the processing, but also for the security. And I just want to note here that there are so many private citizens working on this issue. As Richard mentioned, we're getting so many emails, calls. I was also up at midnight last night getting frantic calls, people, right outside the airport, unable to get in, getting injured, stampeded, providing coordinates that I can then provide to somebody that I know is on the ground and trying to help these people. So our military can be doing more to push out that perimeter. If they have to negotiate something with the Taliban, that can be done. But there are people who are getting to the airport. They're getting very, very close, but then they're being held back by the Taliban. They even have flights that they're manifested on that are leaving without them because of this issue. So the real bottleneck right now is right outside the airport and getting people on and having U.S. military assets and resources focused on this, getting to those people who are in need and who need help actually getting into the airport. This is really the fundamental problem right now that I'm hearing about and that needs to be addressed.
Lisa, let me follow up. So there's a question from Lauren in the audience who asks if we were negotiating directly with the Taliban in Doha until very recently, do we not have an ability to carry out and complete the necessary negotiations to accomplish a full evacuation of all persons, U.S., Afghan, and others? So this gets back to a little bit of what was discussed before, but there are obvious points of contact with Taliban leadership. Is this something we can negotiate?
Well, I think Ambassador Armitage made the point that the Taliban feel victorious. There are lines of communication open. Obviously, we've been hearing that, but at the same time, they've moved from Doha into Kabul. They no longer have the interest in being outside of Afghanistan. So there's no Doha negotiations to speak of. The Taliban leadership has moved into Kabul. They're victorious. So we have a lot less leverage now, obviously. But that's not to say that we shouldn't continue to try to convince them that, it's in their interest not to have these confrontations, this violence, people, pictures of people, bloodied, and the violence. So we need to keep the engagement going, get as many Afghans into the airport, out of the country as possible, convince the Taliban that that is in their interest. But at the same time, we have to be realistic. We have very little leverage at this point. And perhaps there should have been something, in the negotiations earlier, which dealt with this issue. But again, I don't think anybody foresaw the speed with which the Taliban would be able to take over the country. And we can talk about how that happened, what contributed to it. I think there are several issues that have come into play. I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration bear some responsibility for this catastrophe. The Doha agreement that was negotiated by the Trump administration was very weak. It undermined the Afghan government. Therefore, when the U.S. decided to pull all its troops out, the Afghan security forces were demoralized. And so, I think there is a lot of study that needs to go into how did this happen, what contributed to it. And I think it's very important so we don't repeat this, God forbid, in the future.
Ambassador Armitage, let me turn to you. There's a question from Kim, who's asked, how can citizens and veterans help with the safe evacuation of our Afghan allies and SIVs and their families in terms of resources, influence, advocacy, or other ways? And I might actually just extend that question just a little bit, because I think there's some direct lessons that may be drawn upon from the Vietnam experience, which is, these folks are starting to arrive already. I talked this morning with someone, a former colleague of mine who was sponsoring a family, an interpreter and his wife and 6 children have arrived in North Carolina. They're starting to arrive in different places. It's going to be a new experience for these people to live in the United States or wherever they end up. And what's the best approach to sort of the day after once some of these people do get to another shore?
Well, Richard, I think that one of the first things that Americans can do is make sure their elected representatives know that not all Americans fear an influx of Afghan refugees. And just like the Vietnamese, they can be a great addition to the fabric of our society. Second, I think there are NGOs, Lutheran Church Services, and others who are already very active in the resettlements, et cetera. I think also that we have to spend some serious time having local Islamic communities, local mullahs, talk to the incoming Afghan refugees. The reason I value this is the Vietnamese were literate. People are surprised about that, but because of colonialism, they had mandatory 6th grade education. In many cases, our Taliban refugees won't be. The Vietnamese were coming to a country which had some familiarity with religion, with their religions. The Afghans are a little different. In fact, they're coming to a country which enjoys or in disrepute the fact that we are not always seen as open to Islamists, et cetera. So I think there are both monetary issues with NGOs, there are political issues with members of Congress, and there are practical local issues that we can get involved with. My family sponsored, as Richard knows, 40-odd Vietnamese over the years, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's not so expensive. it doesn't disrupt your life. In fact, it may vastly enrich it because, as John Dunn reminded us, we're all involved in humankind.
Yeah, well said. Congressman Moulton, there's a question from Casey Wooten with National Journal. Is there anything additional that Congress can do legislatively to speed up the visa process?
I mean, yes, there is. But again, I'm worried about taking too much action on the visa process when what we need to be doing right now is throwing out the visa process, at least on the ground in Kabul. So my effort when I get to Washington on Monday will not be focused on changing the visa process, but on making sure that the visa process takes place once we get people to safety. The biggest thing that we can do, though, is make it clear that it's not just people who qualify for the existing special immigrant visa who need to get out. There are a lot of people who don't fit in neatly into those categories, but nonetheless are under tremendous threat from the Taliban, including academics who led the charge to let women go to school, who led the charge to liberalize and free society in Afghanistan, and therefore have values that run directly counter to the Taliban. They're going to be under threat. People who were just associated with U.S. military members. I'm in touch with someone who worked for the U.S. military and is deathly afraid for his brother because his brother has been targeted as an Afghan government official and as the brother of someone who worked with the Americans. So there are a lot of people that are under a dire threat who we need to get out and don't fit neatly in these categories. There's work we can do to do that. But the bottom line right now is we just need to get them through the gate.
Let me follow up with you on a question actually is related to your 4 tours in Iraq when you worked with local partners and interpreters and people there. And obviously, as much as we would like to think that this is the last war, I don't think we can assume that. And we will want local partners in the future. Congressman, you've articulated, I think very articulately, the heart reason to do this because of the moral imperative, the obligation we have to the people who worked with us and beyond those people. But there's a head reason, it seems to me as well, which is, we don't want to be known as the people who work with local partners and then leave them behind to suffer their fate as they will. But that's a kind of an overarching theoretical point. Do you think that actually applies on the ground? Do you think the next Iraq or Afghanistan, God forbid, and we're looking, or Syria, and we're looking for local partners, the way that what unfolded now is going to resonate? I mean, what happens if we don't do this well?
So absolutely, this matters. It has huge implications for the next several decades of American national security, for the simple ability of people like myself as a young captain or lieutenant on the ground in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan to get partners and allies, to get people to work with us, to help us with our mission. And by the way, it's not just the U.S. military. It's our intelligence agencies. It's our diplomats, even our contractors, anyone who needs local help around the globe. I remember one of these conversations that I had with one of my very first translators in Iraq when he came to the gate, as he did every day. But this morning he said, Seth, I can't work with you anymore. They came to my house last night. They threatened to kill me and my family if I continued working with the Americans. And over the course of the next couple hours, knowing how important the work we were doing was, I did everything I could to convince Mohammed to keep working with me. And I succeeded. He took great risks to flaunt the threats of the terrorists and put his faith and trust in me. And that's because I said, I'm an American. We're going to do whatever it takes to keep you and your family safe. We've got your back. And importantly, we won't leave you behind. I got Mohammed to America several years later when his life was under even greater threat. He's now here as a proud United States citizen, actually serving the country. But we got to this point because he believed in that promise that I made. And the next time someone tries to make that promise, a young American soldier or Marine, or intelligence officer anywhere in the globe, people are going to look to what's going on in Afghanistan today when they decide whether or not to work with us.
Lisa, let me turn to you for a question from Dr. Wayne Schroeder. How do you view the roles of former President Hamid Karzai and Dr. Abdullah in meeting with Taliban leaders?
Well, look, I come back to Ambassador Armitage's point again that the Taliban have been victorious. I'm not sure what they're discussing, but the Taliban are in such a powerful position now that, I'm not sure what these kinds of talks accomplish. If they can perhaps get something, for the people of Afghanistan on the human rights front or something of that nature, that's fine. But I think the time has passed for any kind of power sharing. The Taliban don't need to power share. So unfortunately, I think that the pursuit of this interim government idea, which the U.S. negotiator pushed for a long time, actually contributed to the divisions among the political leadership, among Ghani, Abdullah, Karzai, and others. And so that's part of the weakness in the political system that we have observed, and again, contributed to sort of the overall collapse of the system that we saw over the last week. So I don't have a lot of confidence in the negotiations that are happening with the Taliban now. I think the die has been cast. They have succeeded in what they were trying to do, which was, basically gain legitimacy by pretending they were interested in the peace process. At the same time, they were pushing militarily and sort of weakening the overall system in this parallel effort. And it was obviously quite an effective strategy that they pursued. And I'm sorry that the U.S. was sort of duped into, being a part of it. I think that the peace process was very unsuccessful, failed to bring any modicum of a peace process or a power sharing settlement. And again, that's on both administrations. And we'll be looking at this for a long time to come. But I'm sorry to say I don't have a lot of confidence in these continuing negotiations that are happening with Karzai and Abdullah and the Taliban at this point.
Lisa, what do you make of the argument? Okay, there's international recognition, U.S. recognition, diplomatic recognition that could be used as a lever. Okay, we've addressed that, but there's also the money side of things. 80% of the Afghan government budget was from international donations. IMF has frozen Afghanistan funds. The Fed has frozen Afghanistan funds. They now have a country to run. One hears, on the one hand, that actually is a source of leverage. We could use those in order to, get some satisfaction on human rights or something like that. Alternatively, they're going to dominate taxation and the poppy trade and all kinds of other things. They're not going to need to go to the IMF as the Taliban in exchange for, concessions on women's rights or something like that. Do you have a sense for that?
Well, I think there are still tools at our disposal, and we have to try to use them, and we have to work in concert with like-minded partners. Look, China, Russia, Pakistan, they may rush to recognize the Taliban. They don't really care about human rights, civil rights in the country. But our UK partners, I would point you to Prime Minister Johnson's speech just the other day, very powerful speech that he gave to the British Parliament on the need to condition any future recognition of the Taliban and what our expectations should be. So the UK, the EU partners, we need to work together and figure out a strategy of how we could potentially try to shape how the Taliban is going to treat its own population, what it's going to do toward the terrorists that we know are there on the ground in Afghanistan. So I think there are tools that we can use, but we have to be very careful. And we may, in fact, we have to continue to get humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people So we're going to have to work with the Taliban at some level to make sure that the Afghan people are protected from a potential humanitarian catastrophe. But we can still sanction Taliban leaders for atrocities that are committed against Afghan civilians. In fact, I've called for sanctions on Taliban leaders for the assassination of the former government state media chief, which happened just 2 weeks ago. So again, when we're looking at, okay, who is the Taliban now? Are they going to respect human rights? Are they going to avoid reprisal killings? We have to remember, just a few weeks ago, they were on a campaign of assassinations of civil society leaders, human rights workers, journalists. So I hope they have changed. I hope they're going to stand by their commitment to not engage in reprisal killings. But I think we have all the reason to be very skeptical.
Ambassador Armitage, I want to ask you about this, the question that I posed to the Congressman about credibility in the future with potential local partners. You've seen a lot of these kind of issues, whether it's the Kurds or Afghanistan, Vietnam. This is always a difficult way to end things. Do you agree that our future credibility and the ability of, someone in the field to get local help and support turns, at least in part, on what they understand to be the past commitments or lack thereof?
Look, Richard, I think Congressman Moulton got it right. We are the United States of America. We are temporarily dislocated. And our credibility gap is not just a matter of refugees fleeing Afghanistan. It's a longer developing situation. Part of it was the previous administration. Part of it is our ability of two administrations to get a handle on COVID. Part of it is our coup attempt on 6th January. And now, of course, we are seen as abandoning our allies. So I think the only way to get out of this hole is, first of all, to stop digging. And to stop digging means we've got to start, again, consulting with our allies. The Brits come to mind immediately. Number two, we've got to be seen as the U.S. military, as U.S. government, heavily involved in trying to save people's lives, to be faithful to our word. And we've got to be seen as being involved that way. And this is not going to be in a year or two to get this credibility back, but it's not necessarily the case that it is gone forever.
Congressman, we have just a few minutes left. There's a question from Daniel Flatley at Bloomberg. This is, in a way, probably brings me back because I wanted to ask you to sort of sum up what you believe the immediate next step should be. So the question is, what does the U.S. need to do at this point to get everyone out by August 31st? I suspect your answer is forget about August 31st. For starters, is that a realistic timeline? What would success look like in this situation? So is it, in addition, you've said, forget August 31st, focus on the mission, forget visa processing in Afghanistan, do visa processing outside of Afghanistan, evacuate as many people as we can, deploy the military necessary to carry out this mission, and include at least contemplating doing something outside the airport, depending on the situation. Is that a fair summation of what you think is the sort of immediate next steps? And is there anything else that you would add to that list?
Yeah, no, Richard, I should get you on my team because you've done a good job of answering the question for me. Yeah,
I did work on the Hill for a while.
I think you've summarized it well. The one thing I would add, and I'd have to defer to Lisa on the prospects for this, is we've gone through a lot of reasons why we don't have leverage over the Taliban. It would be great to try to find some places where we might. Some levers we might be able to pull to extract what essentially amounts to a bit more, a few more favors from them, and just helping get people out. Because sadly, this is pretty pathetic, but we are dependent on them at this point to get people through the country, through Kabul, to that airport gate. And then at that point, it's up to us to get them through the gate and onto airplanes to safety.
There's a question about one or two credible organizations that are doing jobs of resettling and helping people from Afghanistan. In just a moment, when we wrap, we'll put up a slide that has some suggestions. It'll also have the contact at the State Department for folks there who are building the database of at-risk Afghans. So we'll have that up, and we can talk through that for a second. But as we close, Ambassador Armitage, maybe I can close with you. And it strikes me. Maybe I could just ask you to reflect on my observation. I mean, it strikes me that we're at one of these rare moments of history where we will either look back at this operation, forget how Afghanistan went as a war, whether the policy decision to stay or go also, but at this particular operation, either as a source of great pride or great shame in the future. We look back on the evacuation that you led from Saigon, and there's literally people to this day making Academy Award nominated films about what you and they did on the ground, because we see this as a source of pride 46 years later. Is that how this feels right now? Are we at one of those moments where what we do over the next few days is going to be remembered for ill or for good, and as a country we'll either take pride or shame in what happens for decades?
I take a great deal of pride already in the service of our service members who have passed in Afghanistan, and that'll never be taken away. I cannot think, if we continue down the same path, that we'll be looking back in pride. In fact, the Vietnam operation to which you referred, Richard, was aided and abetted by people like Lionel Rosenblatt, Colonel Mike Island, all rogue radical elements doing their own thing, because the U.S. government wasn't taking possession, wasn't taking cognizance of this effort. So it was a bunch of free-floating radicals that got it done. And unless we turn around, and I think it, frankly, it involves the use of some military force, and are seen as moving heaven and earth, to be truthful to our word, that we are not going to be able to look back with pride on this moment. But as I say, I look back with pride on those who have served and those who have sacrificed. I'm proud of them. I'm proud of their service, and I love them for it.
Absolutely. Congressman Moulton, Ambassador Armitage, Lisa Curtis, thank you all for joining us. In just a second, actually, if the folks listening to this, Shai and company, can put up the slide with some organizations, we'll just close out. For those who are interested in learning more, you can make me off the screen and make that bigger so people can actually read it. You have obviously UNHCR, the International Rescue Committee, Women for Women International, No One Left Behind, Lutheran Social Services, and then in the bottom right, you see the contact email for the State Department group task force that is managing this and building the databases of at-risk Afghans, hopefully for evacuation. Each of these does different things, but at least that's a starting point for anyone who's interested in doing more. Again, thank you so much to our speakers. Thanks to those who tuned in for this and joined otherwise, and we'll have more to come soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.